Hi guys, and welcome to ACT Prep for English Reading and Writing sections through an introduction to the Beat Generation. So in this class, I've kind of talked to you a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. An important date to remember for that is that the Civil War happened from 1861 to 1865, and then in the 1920s and 1930s, we saw all of these black writers and artists coming to prominence in Harlem, New York, right after that, pretty much. And then we also talked a little bit about the lost generation of expatriate writers in the 20th century, post World War I and II. So World War I was 1914 to 1918, World War II was 1939 to 1945, and these writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, all of these guys, and one lady, were writing and coming to prominence after World War II. And these two movements, the Harlem Renaissance and the lost generation of expatriate writers in literary modernism, kind of had some similar themes. They both felt a little lost. They felt oppressed. A lot of other people were engaging in hedonism, experimenting with sex, drugs, alcohol, the live while we're young mentality. So they went through some similar emotions. And now we're going to talk about the Beat Generation, which is also kind of happening a little bit after World War II in the 50s. You're going to see them actually engage in hedonism, the experimentation with drugs, sex, alcohol for their work. You're going to see them feel oppressed, kind of, not in tune with mainstream society, and that's kind of why they form this underground writing community. But we're going to get started and we're kind of going to explore the Beat Generation and those writers now through some ACT prep. So let's get started. So for those of you who don't know, the ACT for the English reading writing sections, particularly for the English and reading sections, they're going to give you a brief paragraph and then several multiple choice questions with 4 choices, and you pick the best answer for whatever correction needs to be made. I'm extending that direction here a little bit and saying that I want you to find the corrections on your own. I just feel like that's a greater challenge for you to find them by yourself. So here the direction says read and determine the corrections. There are actually 8 in this paragraph. I'm going to read it first, then I want you to read it to yourself and find the corrections, and then I'll give you some time to come write them on the board. I'll let everyone have a chance to use the marker to come write. So here we go. The Beat Generation writers receiving recognition in the 1950s and, similar to the Lost Generation writers, fought hard against formal, emotionless writing, capitalism and materialism, and other social mores. Another commonality was that both movements' writers focused their work on hedonism to include sexual fluidity, drugs, and alcohol. Jazz music, spiritualism, and nature were popular topics for the Beats, too. So take a minute, read it to yourself. I'll give you some time, and then everyone can just volunteer as they feel like it to come right on the board. All right, guys, thank you for finding those corrections. So let's look at it more closely. The Beat Generation writers receiving recognition, that doesn't make sense because the rest of the paragraph is in past tense. So we want to change receiving to received. The Beat Generation writers received recognition in the 1950s. Here's another one. We don't need an apostrophe S when we're talking about years. We just need to write 1950S, the 1950s. They're not possessive. It's a common error, so good job spotting that. And, similar to the Lost Generation writers, fought hard against formal, emotionless writing, capitalism and materialism, and other social mores. In this one sentence, we have about 5 commas. So what we need to do to make that easier to read, break that up a little bit better, we're going to put a semicolon after emotionless writing instead of a comma. And then after capitalism and materialism, we're going to put a semicolon instead of a comma. So it'll read the same way, but we just want semicolons to break that up a little bit better, make it easier to read so we don't confuse all of our commas in this sentence. So fought hard against formal emotionless writing, semicolon, capitalism and materialism, semicolon, and other social mores. Another commonality was that both movements' writers, that's an error because we're talking about two different movements. We're talking about the Beat Generation and the Lost Generation writers. So we're saying another commonality was that both movements writers, the two movements writers, we have apostrophe S there. It should be S apostrophe because we're talking about more than one thing having possession over the writers. So movement S apostrophe writers focus their work on hedonism to include sexual fluidity, drugs, and alcohol. To include is awkward. It's another tense issue, so we want to say including. Focus their work on hedonism, including sexual fluidity, drugs, and alcohol. Jazz music, spiritualism, and nature. This is going to be a choice thing. Typically in literature, you're going to see an Oxford comma, which is a comma following the second to last item in a series. So we need a comma after spiritualism here. Jazz music, comma, spiritualism, comma, and nature were popular topics for the beats too. And then after beats and before the word to, we need a comma. If to were in the middle of the sentence, you would need a comma before and after it. And that's all 8. So we had to change the tense of 2 words. We had to take the apostrophe out of 1950s. We had to add 2 semicolons. We had to fix an apostrophe for movements writers. And we had to fix an Oxford comma and the word to. So that should be 8 altogether. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, just to give you guys a little break here, this is an illustration of Allen Ginsberg, who some people argue is the first beat writer. His famous controversial poem debuted in 1955, which we're going to talk about now. All right, so the difference with this passage is that sometimes in the ACT, they'll give you in parentheses a choice of 2 words, and you have to pick the best choice. Sometimes it'll be a spelling issue. Sometimes it'll be just a matter of like, well, this word makes more sense in this context, but it'll be very close to the other word. So for this passage, I'd like you to read, select the best choice in parentheses, and determine the other corrections, like in the paragraph we just did. This one is a doozy. It's got 13 errors in it, or 13 choices you have to make. So there are 3 pairs of words you have to choose from in parentheses. So that takes care of 3 of them, and then you have to find another 10 errors and correct them. So I'm going to read the passage to you. You can have some time to read it to yourself, and then you can come up to the board and write the corrections on the screen. So here we go. Allen Ginsberg arguably began the movement with his 1955 poem Howl. Jack Kerouac, however, coining the term Beat Generation because a counterculture of writers felt beated down. The other writers were Gary Snyder, Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Charles Bukowski, among others. One might even term these dudes as beatniks, and you have to choose the correct spelling, the most correct spelling. Like artists of the Harlem Renaissance, the Beats made a migration, though the Beats was from New York to San Francisco. So take a minute, look at it, and then everyone can just kind of volunteer to come write their corrections on the board as they feel like it. Okay guys, thank you for finding the answers. I know that was a lot, so I appreciate your cooperations and patience with me. So let's just start at the first line, take it one at a time. Allen Ginsberg arguably began the movement. So argumentatively, no one's, that doesn't really make sense because that's to suggest that it's a combative thing. Arguably sounds like the better choice here, even though they're similar words. Allen Ginsberg argumentatively began the movement, or, was he arguing that he began the movement is kind of what that sounds like. Or is it better to say Allen Ginsberg arguably began the movement? I think that second choice sounds better. Allen Ginsberg arguably began the movement with his 1955 poem Howl. Here's the problem with Howl. We need quotation marks around poems. Shorter works tend to have quotation marks. So if you're talking about a specific episode of Friends, or you're talking about a poem, or you're talking about an article you read, or a song, we want to put those in quotes. And then longer works like novels, biographies, textbooks, we want to put those in italics or underline them. So for Howl, we need quotation marks before the H and quotation marks after the period, because any punctuation marks always fall within the quotation marks. So quotes after that period after Howl. Jack Kerouac, and then it says however. Whenever you have however in the middle of a sentence, you need a comma on either side of it. So Jack Kerouac, comma, however, comma. Coining is not correct here. It's in the wrong tense. So we need to put it in the past tense to say, Jack Kerouac, however, coined the term beat generation because a counterculture of writers felt beat or beated down. Beated down sounds awkward. Beat is already kind of in the past tense. So it sounds better to say because a counterculture of writers felt beat down. So that whole sentence, Jack Kerouac, comma, however, comma, coined the term beat generation because a counterculture of writers felt beat down. And then we see an error here at beat down because at the word down, we have a quotation mark and then a period, and that's not correct. We need the quotation mark after the period. Then we come to the other writers were, colon. Now, this is not correct because you can't have a colon immediately following a verb. It's just not correct sentence structure. It's not the way we use colons. So you would have to say something like, the other writers were the following, or you would have to have some completed sentence. You have to have a complete sentence and not just a phrase to be able to use a colon. So I might write, the other writers were the following, or these writers were also beats, colon, or these writers were also beat writers, or also in the beat generation, colon. Gary Snyder, Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Charles Bukowski, comma, among others. The comma after Bukowski and before among is kind of a choice. You probably will be asked something like this on the ACT. It's just a nice way to break up another phrase from your listed series. So after Bukowski, a comma, and then before among. One might even term these dudes as beatniks. This might be tricky if you've never seen this word before. If we're talking about beatnik poets and, you know, the guys who play the bongos and stuff, it's the first choice. I know it probably looks weird not to have the CKS, but it's actually beatniks, N-I-K-S. Like artists of the Harlem Renaissance, comma, the Beats made a migration, comma, though the Beats was from New York to San Francisco. We need commas in those two places after Renaissance and after migration because they're kind of complex phrases. So we say, like artists of the Harlem Renaissance, we have so many words that are starting off the sentence. We kind of want to break that off from the rest. Like artists of the Harlem Renaissance, there's a pause there, comma, the Beats made a migration. And then because we have the word though following the word migration, we need to cut that off from that thought as well. So migration, comma, though the Beats was from New York to San Francisco. If we look at the word beats, we have to think, is that plural and possessive? And it is. It's just like that situation we had in the last passage where we were talking about both movements writers. Both the movements, two different movements have possession over their own writers. So here we're talking about multiple beat poets having possession over a migration or having made a migration. The beats, so it should be B-E-A-T-S apostrophe because it's their migration. There's possession there. The beats was from New York to San Francisco. So altogether, that should have been 13. We did arguably at the beginning, we talked about quotation marks around howl, the commas before and after however. We changed the tense of coining to coined. We said that a counterculture of writers felt beat down. The other writers were, we talked about correct colon usage, comma after Bukowski, among others. One might even term these dudes as beatniks, pick the first word in those parentheses there. And then like artists of the Harlem Renaissance, comma, the beats made a migration, comma, though the beats was from New York to San Francisco. So we should have 13 choices there. If there were any that I missed, please let me know. And on to the next one. Oh, and one I forgot, because a counterculture of writers felt beat down, period, then the quotation mark. And then around 1955 poem Howl, the quotation mark has to come before the H and after the period. Not after the L, but after the period. So I just wanted to make that distinction. And altogether, that should be 13. I did forget to mention those. So let's just move on to the next one. Here's a cool cat, meow, now, because puns are the best. So I'm sure you guys have seen portrayals of beatnik poets before. They've always got, you know, their little bongo drums, and they're kind of hippy dippy, dressed in all black. They've got the beret and the weird facial hair. So this is kind of the kind of guy we're talking about. LSD was the major experimental drug of choice for these writers. It was a drug that helped them, you know, be creative, or so they said. There's, you know, a lot of people who would argue that, oh, they just got hooked on it, and some of them were like, no, it helps me write. So remember that LSD is the major drug of choice, of experimental choice in this period. All right, so now we're going to read Lawrence Ferlinghetti's Junkman's Obbligato. This is just the first part of it. It's an excerpt, and we're going to respond to the 2 writing prompts that follow it. So Junkman's Obbligato, interestingly, was supposed to be spoken to jazz music, and that's why it kind of sounds catchy and syncopated. So I'm going to read it to you. You'll have time to read it to yourself, and then I'll show the writing prompt, since there is a writing prompt, an optional writing prompt portion of the ACT. Some colleges require it, most do not, but it's good to stretch your muscles and take it anyway. It's not super difficult. So here we go, Ferlinghetti's Junkman's Obbligato. Let's go, come on, let's go, empty our pockets and disappear. Missing all our appointments and turning up unshaven years later. Old cigarette papers stuck to our pants, leaves in our hair. Let us not worry about the payments anymore. Let them come and take it away, whatever it was we were paying for. Think about where the breaks are. Anytime you see a slash mark, that's to indicate that it's the end of the line of poetry and that you're going to the next line. This is all one stanza, I believe, this excerpt, and there may be 2 others that follow it in the whole poem. Think about the themes of the beat generation. Think about how they turn up here. I'm going to come back to this screen in a second, but I want you to see the writing prompts. So you have 2 writing prompts. Now, based on what you know of the beat generation's history and writing characteristics, cite specific examples from the poem to demonstrate that it is in fact reminiscent of the beat movement, attitude, etc. And then, can you relate to or empathize with the attitude of the beats? Why or why not? Support your answer with what you know of the Beat Generation. Time period, attitudes, major events, writing characteristics, etc. So you can use anything from the previous slides to support your arguments, to justify your arguments for your poem analysis right now. So I'm going to go back to this screen. Your two responses to the writing prompts I just gave you are the only things I want you to turn in today from this ACT prep session. Everything else you can keep. I'm going to make you printouts of the passages we read and like those corrections. This, however, I want your writing responses back because I'm going to grade them the way the ACT grades them, like with their grading system. So I'd like you to turn these in as soon as you're finished. And if anyone needs me to go back to the writing prompt screen or to any other slides, just let me know. I figured you'd need the poem more, but just raise your hand and let me know if I need to switch. So I'll give you a few minutes to kind of jot some things down. For the ACT, you'll generally have, I think it's 30 minutes to construct a response for one prompt. But we don't have a whole lot of time today because I want to do an extension video after this. So take a little bit of time. Don't stress out about it. It's not a major grade. It's more of like a formative assessment, just to see where you are in your timed writing skills. Okay. All right, now that I've collected everyone's things, we're going to watch a high school student's mockumentary on the Beat Generation. It's called The Mad Ones, A Brief History of the Beat Generation. So I'd like you guys to all type in this, this link address on your iPads and watch it silently. And I'll start grading those writing samples. So, you might be wondering, what's a mockumentary? It sounds a lot like the word documentary, doesn't it? A mockumentary is a moving visual medium, in other words, a video, that takes the format of a documentary but satirizes both the documentary format and conventions and the subject topic itself. So some famous mockumentary examples. I'm sure you've all seen The Office, talking about mundane office life. Mascots is a movie on Netflix about mascots preparing for competition. It's real corny and very aggressive. What We Do in the Shadows is filmed in New Zealand, and it's about these three vampires who are not threatening at all. They're hilarious. And then, of course, Andy Samberg's pop star Never Stop, Never Stopping is based on Justin Bieber and his hit song Never Say Never. All really hilarious, funny mockumentaries. Mockumentaries generally are comedic in nature. But I'd like you guys all to go watch this mockumentary on the Beat Generation. This girl did a really great job of playing all the parts. She plays Allen Ginsberg. She plays all of these people from the Beat Generation. It's really worth the watch. Maybe you guys could do something like this, but go watch it. I'm going to start grading those samples right now, and I hope this was helpful for your test this weekend.